today we are going to work on Simplicity 9140. This dress is so cute. It looks like two pieces. It's actually one, and it's got these little side panels here that are cinched up. It's the way they're cut. They look like pickups, and a little drawstring. I actually really like this. It's going to be fun to make, and we are going to use this really nice rayon. It's like a rayon challis from, it's old, it was in my stash. I think it was from B&J Fabric in New York. That would be my guess. So I really like it. It's kind of a medium weight. It has no stretch. It has a little bit of stretch. And then, but it's got some weighty body to it. So it's really kind of a nice little fabric to use, and it's slippery and it should be great. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to stay stitch the neckline edge on the front and the back. That's piece one and piece two. And you want to do that because as we're manipulating it and doing other things, we don't want that to stretch out of shape. So I believe that the seam allowances on this are 5/8 of an inch. So when we do our stay stitching, we want to do it within that 5/8 of an inch, so we don't have to rip it out. So 3/8 or 1/2 an inch. The goal of it is to stabilize this. So we're going to do each piece separately, and then we are going to sew the shoulder seams together. So this is going to go up really quick. We're doing version A, which has sleeves. We're doing a short sleeve version, and yeah, with the long skirt from version C. So we're kind of combining the two different illustrations that they have on the pattern. All right, we'll be back with shoulders and stay stitching and getting ready to do the facing for the neck. Alrighty, I stay stitched the front neck edge and the back neck edge, and I sewed my shoulder seams together. Now, the pattern calls for a facing for the neck edge, and if you know me and you know me well, you know that I don't like facings, and they're so old school, and also I don't like to follow the rules so much. So there's better ways of doing it than the big four will show you. Certainly you can cut out the facings and you attach them at the shoulder seam, just like you sew these shoulders together, and lay them right sides together and stitch it and turn it on the inside. My problem with that is that they fall out. You know, when you're wearing it, they're flopping around. I don't think it's a good option. So there are a couple of other options. If you have something that's really stretchy, that's got a good stretch to it, you can just turn it. You'll have a little problem with the V in the back. You'll have to put a split there. That probably is not the best solution. I like bias binding, or this is fold over elastic. And you can see in the middle of the elastic there's a ridge, and that just helps the elastic fold. And essentially you pin it on and you fold it over the edge of your opening. Now this takes a little practice, and I would suggest pinning it. One of the things that you want to consider is that the elastic should be a little bit smaller than your opening. So I've just pinned, I've just pinned that on there. You can see that you see the black, so it's kind of nice. It's like a black trim, and you stitch it right here on the edge. So it takes a little practice, but a really pretty black bias binding or something, even the self bias for the fabric would work beautifully. The thing about the fold over elastic is you want to make it smaller than the neck edge. So this is a pretty big neck edge. It's probably 12, probably close to 18 inches all the way around. So I want my bias binding to be about an inch smaller, or my fold over elastic, either one, because you want them smaller because you want them to suck in the neck edge. So one of the ways you can do that is to walk this around your fabric all the way around, measuring very precisely, as I'm doing here, till you get to the other end, and then you want to allow enough for it to seam together, and then take off an inch, and that will make it smaller and it will help that neckline suck in. So when you wear it, it falls close to the body. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do fold over elastic, but certainly you can use a facing. They have the pieces, the facing pieces are piece 4 and 5, and you construct them is the mirror image of this. But finish the edges. When you stitch them in, understitch them and tack them to the seams. The problem is this is going to come out in the back and it's going to come out in the front. There's nothing to hold it in place. So you either have to kind of top stitch it in place, and for this I didn't want that look, or you have to find an alternative. So my alternative is fold over elastic. All right, before I sew on this fold over elastic, I wanted to give you a little bit more information about how this is going to work. So this is my back, this is my front, and I pinned a piece of the fold over elastic and I measured it all the way around, and then I cut it 1 inch shorter and I stitched it together so I have a circle. And you want to make sure that you don't twist it while you're stitching it, right? So I just stitched it together really closely at the seam there. The other thing that you want to think about is when you sew on a facing, you have a 5/8 inch seam allowance that's going to end up getting stitched, and then so your garment is 5/8 of an inch smaller, or your neckline is 5/8 of an inch bigger than what you're looking at for raw edges. Well, the fold over elastic fits over the seam allowance, so where you are is where you're going to be. So what I did was I went and took the 5/8 inch seam allowance and I trimmed it down to about 1/4 of an inch, because I'm going to apply this on the top and I want the neckline to still be the same. So I had to get rid of that extra fabric. The next thing I want to do is I have my center back, that's where the seam is. I want to find my center front. Because this elastic is smaller than the neck edge, I folded it in half and just pinned my center front. So I have a seam allowance on my center back and a pin in my center front. And I'm going to do the same thing with the garment. I'm going to match up the shoulders and I'm going to pin my center front. I'm going to match up the shoulders again, and pin my center back is easy because there's a little bit of a V there. And honestly, even with the facing, you're not going to get a really crisp V in the back. The only time you can get a really nice V is if you have a seam down the back, and this front is cut, this back piece is cut on the fold, so there's no, it's not going to be a beautiful V-neck for sure. So now I have my bias tape, my fold over elastic, and I'm just going to match up these pins. So I'm going to match up the center front pin just so I know where it's going, right? Because this is a little bit smaller. I'm just going to go around and I'm going to match up my center back. Now I can go ahead and sew it on. I can take it to the machine and pay attention to sewing it on. The other thing, because this is elastic, the foot doesn't glide over it really nicely. So a Teflon foot, this happens to be a Teflon foot, is a really big help. These aren't very expensive, and if you have a snap-on type, they're pretty much universal. It makes a huge difference when you're sewing with leather or suede or something like this, elastic, anything where you want the machine to kind of glide over the fabric. So I'm going to sew that on. Now, the other thing that they have you do is a set-in sleeve, and I'm doing the short sleeve, sleeve B, and this is my little armhole here. There's no gathering in the instructions for the sleeve, which makes me think that the sleeve is a 1-to-1. I'm not worried about fitting in all kinds of ease. So I'm going to skip over doing the side seams, and I'm going to insert the sleeve first flat. And this method is fabulous, and I'm going to show you how it's done. So this is the back of my garment, this is the front of my garment. A couple of things you need to know. On your tissue, you need to mark or pin mark this center dot up here, because that aligns with your shoulder seam, so you want that right on. And the other one that I mark is the double notch. And I'm not really careful about marking it. I just put a pin there because what that lets me know is that's the back side of my sleeve. Because sometimes this sleeve is symmetrical, I suspect. Yes, it's pretty symmetrical. It's almost dead on, but not quite. So you can see the shape is a little different at the top. So you want to make sure that the back of your sleeve goes to the back of your garment. So here's my sleeve. This one is the back, so this is the wrong side. And I just put a pin in there. So there's a pin here for the back, and here's a pin for the shoulder seam, and the pin is on the other side, just so I know that that's the back of my garment. So I'm going to, because I have them laid right side up, I'm going to flip my sleeve over so they're right sides together, and I'm going to match up this center pin with my shoulder seam allowance. Now I'm going to flip the whole thing over because I want the sleeve to be down towards the feed dogs. The feed dogs will move that fabric a little bit faster on the bottom than the presser foot moves it on the top. And I want the feed dogs to help me fit this sleeve into this armhole. So I'm going to flip the whole thing over, but now it's pinned, right? So I know that it's where it's supposed to be. All right. So I like to start with the edge of my sleeve, and I pin that, and I work my way up to about where the notch is, because that's a 1-to-1 ratio. There's no ease in this section of the sleeve. It's the underarm. This fabric is a little slippery, so I'm going to have to use more pins than I usually do because it's slipping around. But this underarm section, we don't want any gathering, right? There's no ease. The ease is all up here in the cap of the sleeve. So I'm going to go to my other side, and I'm going to pin the edge mark, which is the underarm and the side seam, which we'll take care of later. And I'm going to pin that up to about where the notch is. So now I have the edges pinned, and I have to pin these two sections from the shoulder seam to where the notch is, where they'll be fitting. And really, it's just a exercise in fabric coercion, and you work your way down the seam until you get it to fit. So this side is fitting in really well. So this is how you put in a knit sleeve in almost every garment. And for some wovens, you can actually do this. This fabric has a little bit of stretch in it, and the pattern doesn't have a very full sleeve. So it's a really good combination and an opportunity to sew the sleeve in this way. Just keep pinning this until I get all of that fullness into my sleeve. And I may have to pin it and unpin it a couple of times, but it will get there. There we go. Now, if you're at all nervous about putting the sleeve in, just baste it. Use a long stitch on your machine and baste it. Take the pins out, see how you like it. And if you have to fix a little notch or glitch or something, then you only take out a little bit of section and spacing stitches, so that makes it easy. Once you're happy with it, then you can go back and stitch it and do the other side. I also sewed my sleeves on. They look great. So I have my sleeve, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and do my side seams. So now I'm going to fold this in half, and I'm going to match up this bottom seam. This is where the waist, it's a high-waisted little top, where that is. I'm going to match up the underarm of my sleeve, because that's really important. If you lift your arm up, you want that seam to match. And I'm going to match the edge of my sleeve. And I'm just going to stitch that seam on both sides down the sleeve. Actually, because the seam allowances are pressed towards the sleeve to give you a nice sleeve cap, I'm going to start here at the waist, sew up to the sleeve, pivot just a little bit and sew down that way. So I'm going to do that on both sides, and our top, with the exception of the hemming of the sleeves, is finished. So that was pretty quick. So the next thing we're going to do is to take piece 7, the front and the back, and stitch them along this long, along this long straight side, all the way along this long straight side. So we're going to stitch both of those together. I'm going to press them open, I believe, because I'm not serging them, so I'm going to press both of them open, and then we'll come back and we'll do pockets. All right, we have sewn together the 2 piece 7s, or 4, there's 2 for the front and 2 for the back, and now we're going to put the pocket on. And the first thing that we want to do is to mark where our pocket is going to go. So I have pin marked the pocket here on these circle dots. Slide this over here. On this piece 7, there's 2 circle dots, and that's where our pocket is going to match up to. So I've stuck a pin through the circle dot on the tissue, and now I'm just going to remove that pin, I'm going to stick a pin into the fabric. So the pin is already there, marking the space, but I need to get rid of the tissue, so I'm just replacing the pin, essentially. So now I have 2 pins here marked, and I'm going to do the same thing with my pocket. I'm going to match up the tissue and these dots on my pocket, and I'm going to pin mark these dots, these large circles, because that's how I'm going to match up my pocket with my side seam. So again, I have the pocket here with the pattern on top of it. I'm just going to stick a pin through these large circles, and then I lift up the tissue and replace that pin, so it's actually, the pin is going just through the fabric, right? Because I want to remove the tissue piece, and now my pocket is marked. I mean, you can use, I prefer you didn't clip into the seams. I don't think that's a great way to mark things. You can use chalk or whatever markers you would like, but for me this works perfectly. Now I just line up my pins, bada boom, bada bing. All right, so I just line up my pins, and then I'm going to pin my pocket down. I'm going to stitch it. It asks you to stitch a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that is what I am going to do. You do 1 on each side of the front and 1 on each side of the back. And when you've finished, you're going to press the pocket towards the seam allowance. So the pocket gets pressed this way. So the seam allowance and the pocket are going the same way, and you understitch. So when I come back, we will have assembled all the pockets on our front and back and pressed and understitched them. We'll take a look at that, and then we'll put the skirt together. All right, here we go. Here's the top of my skirt, and here is my pocket. I sewed it on this way, and I can't impress upon you enough, and if you know me, you know I'm always harping on this, pressing as you sew. So I sewed the pockets on, I pressed them flat, then I pressed them open, and you are going to get a much better seam and finished look, and finished construction for that matter, if you press each seam as you go along. You can't get the same type of seam flatness once you do it all at the end. And then after you sew it on, I'm trying to find the one that I finished here. After you sew your pocket on and you press it, and you press the seams, the pocket and the seams all in the same direction, because you want this piece here to be going that way. You don't want it folding back on itself. You have to stitch it so everything gets pressed in that direction. And then you understitch this. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're anchoring the pocket to the seam allowance, because when you finish sewing the pocket, it's actually going to turn inside. This is where your hand is going to go. So you want to understitch that. And if you can see, there's the row of stitching here that I stitched the pocket on, and right next to it is another row of stitching. That's the stitching that holds the pocket facing to the seam allowance. So it holds the pocket facing to the seam allowance, and it keeps it flat and keeps it from rolling. So when I press this, it will make it roll under. So I've done that to all 4 pockets, and now I am going to pin up my side seams, matching all of my marks. It's a big skirt. There's a lot going on here. Okay, so this is the top, the waistband of the skirt, and I've pinned it down to the notch on the pocket. This notch here that's on the pocket. You have 2, those are stitching notches or stitching circles. So I'm going to pin this to this dot, and that's where I'm going to sew. I'm going to sew to there, and I'm going to back tack. And I want to take care that this part of the pocket that I've already sewn is together. Like, you don't want one side flipping out, so when you sew this seam allowance, you see that pocket seam in there. Then I'm going to sew the pocket all the way around to this lower dot, which is this one down here, this lower dot, and then continue down. And again, I'm going to make these seams so there's no bump in there, and I want to make sure I get past this seam where I sewed the pocket to the side. And then I'm going to continue down. Now they have you sewing to this corner. Remember, this has a faux pickup, right? It has this little dent in the seam, right? Here's the hem down here. So it has this little dent in it, this little bump. So I'm going to sew off, and then I'm going to get back on and sew to the bottom of my garment. The reason you do that is because if you pivot here and your stitch doesn't completely connect with the bobbin stitch, you're going to have a skip stitch. And so it's not going to be as structurally sound, but also you're not going to get as nice of a corner. Now I know this is supposed to be a faux pickup, but I still like the process of stitching off and getting back on and stitching on again. So I'm going to sew down around my pocket, down the side, and down the bottom edge for both side seams, and our skirt will be almost finished. So we'll put that together with the top, and we're very close to the end of this really cute Simplicity 9140 dress. As you can see, I've stitched my side seam. I stitched here to the edge of the pocket, and I back tacked a couple of times because I do pivot here, and then came all the way around my pocket up across the bottom, and again I back tacked there, stitched down to the pickup and off, and then picked up back on again and stitched all the way to the hem. And what you'll see when you turn it on the other side is a really nice seam. So that pocket is beautiful, and there's something about a well-constructed pocket in a garment. And you can see there's no, you don't see any of the other stitching going on there. This has been pressed, and there's my understitching, so it's inside. The whole garment needs another press, but in general, it looks great. I'm really pleased with the outcome of this. Now we're getting ready to set the skirt to the bodice, and you can see that there's gatherings here. So we need to gather this whole top up because this skirt is enormous. It's so big. And the pattern tells you to notch underneath the pocket. Let me just show you that really quick. I didn't do that because I don't like cutting into seams. Sometimes I do, but in this case, this fabric, I'm not 100% sure that it's not going to fray a little bit. So they want you to notch. This is my pocket. This is my pocket. They want you to notch here so you can take this seam and press it open. But when you do that, you're cutting into the structure of the garment, and I don't particularly care for that. So I pressed all the seams towards the front. That way my pocket will lie towards the front and all my seams will go that way. And it's easier, I don't have to cut into the garment. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put a gathering stitch all the way around the top of the garment. And I think because this is so big, this is huge, trying to gather this in with one stitch will be difficult. So I'm going to sew I'm going to set my machine to baste, which is the longest stitch you can get on your machine. And I'm going to sew from one side all the way across at like a little bit more than 5/8. So maybe not quite an inch, just shy of an inch. And then also again at 3/8. So when I sew the seam at 5/8, the basting stitches will be on either side of my seam, and I won't cross into the basting stitch, making it easier to pull them out. So you do 2 rows, and I'm going to do 2 rows on the front and leave really long tails, and then 2 rows on the back and leave really long tails on either side, because that gives you the opportunity to pull it back and forth. Now, if you feel the need to add the notches in, now is the time to mark them if you haven't done so already. And if you look at this top piece, there are notches here. Those line up with the notches at the bottom of the bodice. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think you can line up the center front, and I'll be happy with that, because you only have a space like this you're trying to fit in. We can mark the center front with a pin on the bodice and match it up to this seam line here in the center front. So I think that's the way I'm going to go. So I'm going to go baste this, and then we're going to have some fun pulling gathering stitches. Now we have a little work ahead of us. So as you can see, I've done 2 rows of basting stitches, and it's already started to gather some of my fabric up. So this is at 5 inches. This is my center front seam, and I press that open, so I want to make sure that when I do the basting stitches, it stays nice and open. And then since I pressed my side seams towards the front, I made sure when I stitched them that I stitched them in the right place, so they actually are going towards the front. So when I go over that with a real stitch, they're going to be fine. And then we have all these threads hanging out, which drive me absolutely crazy, but that's what we need in order to make our piece gather up. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find the center front and the center back of our bodice, because we need to make that big skirt piece fit this small bodice. So in order to do that, I'm going to put the side seams together at the bottom, the lower edge here. I'm just going to pin them, and then I'm going to fold. So I've pinned the side seams. I'm going to fold from the side seam to this is either the front or the back, and put a pin in there, and then I'm going to do the other side. Make sure that's nice and straight and even, and put a pin in there, and now I can take this pin out. So this is the front. So this is the center front where this pin is of my top. And then I know the front of my skirt bottom is the way that my pockets are pressed, right, and stitched. So I know that this is the front of my skirt bottom because I can look at it. So see how much bigger that is? Woo-wee! Now I want to match this seam. We have a seam in the center front to the pin that I put in the center front, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing in the back. I'm going to match the center back to that seam that's in the back here. But I also want to do this right sides together, and I want to match the side seams up. So the side seams need to get matched, and the center front. And if you marked the notches, those would need to get matched up also. But essentially I'm taking it in sections of 4. So I have from the side seam to the center front, and I need to make that fit from the center front to the side seam on the bodice. Now the other thing you want to think about is you want to put the skirt down towards the feed dogs on the machine. So we have to think about that when we're pinning, because we want this gathering to be on the feed dogs. The feed dogs will help us gather that fabric in a little bit better. All right, so in order to do that, we need to put right sides together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the skirt up towards the bodice. It's essentially going to swallow my bodice. But I have the center front right here, and my center front of my skirt and my center front pin, and I'm going to pin those together from the bodice side, because I want my pins on the bodice side and I want my skirt down below. So now my pin is in place. I can start picking this up. I know it's actually going to match where it's going to go. So as I pick this up, I still have my center front, and here's my side. So I want to find the side of my skirt and match those up. And all of these threads that you have hanging here, pull them out of the way. I want to be able to access them. And we really want this to line up as best we can. There we go. So now I have something that looks like this. I have this big section here, and I'm going to take the threads on one side, not all 4 threads, but the threads on one side of the fabric. All right, I found the 2 threads, and I'm just going to start pulling them. And as I pull them, I'm going to gather these stitches up until they are the same size as my bodice piece. That's pretty close. All right. So now my 2 pieces are essentially the same size. Actually, I've gathered it in too much, but some of that is going to alleviate as I move this around. So I want to balance this gathering, and this is why we only do a quarter of the piece at a time, because if we did the whole thing, it would be so overwhelming. Right, that is almost there. So you just keep playing with it, and you want these stitches, these pleats or tucks fairly even. That looks pretty good. So now I can start to pin. And I'm going to pin from the bodice side, remember, because I want these tucks on the lower section. And you know, a good amount of pins for something like this is not a bad thing, because you have all of those gathers underneath, and you don't want them to fold out of the way and cause issues. So I made that a little bit too small. I'm just going to loosen this up again. Sometimes you have to go through it a couple of times. It's part of the process. Okay. So that one section is pinned. I have gathers, and this is nice and flat on this side. And I'm going to do the whole section, the other 3/4, and then I'm going to baste it, because I want to make sure that it's exactly the way I want it. So I'm going to pin it all, then I'm going to baste it, look at it, make sure I'm happy with the way it looks from the right side, and then if I am, go ahead and stitch it. If I'm not, I'll fix the little sections of basting that need to be fixed, and then stitch it. And then we just have hems. Now, I'll be honest with you, sewing a big skirt like this with all this gathering with all of these strings hanging out is like one of my least favorite things to do. However, you can't get this look without processing this great big skirt. So here's my skirt, and inside is my top. And I've just basted it. I haven't even looked at it. So I'm going to open it up, and before I stitch it, I want to go around and check all of my seams. Do they line up at the edges? I don't have any pleats or wrinkles that I'm unhappy with. Certainly you don't want any in the bodice. And then you don't want any, like, sometimes you catch something. We want to make sure before we go ahead and stitch it, that side seam looks great, that we don't have anything that has to be fixed, because now with the basting stitches, now is the time to fix it. But this looks great. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm all the way back around to the other side. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back around again and stitch it with a regular 3.5 stitch, and then take out all of those threads that are like driving me crazy right at the moment. I can't stand looking at them. And then we're going to press it up towards the bodice, and then we're going to take a look at the hem. And then we'll be done. Wowie. So here we are. We have finished up Simplicity 9140. We have our beautiful neckline that's done with fold over elastic. We have terrific sleeves that we've put in, and we've just turned the edge twice on those and stitched them. Pretty simple. We added this huge skirt, right? And then we have these really cute faux pickups on the side of the skirt, which gives it a really nice look. And then for the hem, I turned it 1.5 inches and stitched it. Very simple, very quick and easy. You kind of have this little bubble look going on. And I had to take photos out in the snow because it's snowing here today. So I hope you enjoy the little winter wonderland scene. But until next time, this is Sandy from Sewing with Sandy, and I hope that you will subscribe to our channel and follow along on our sew-alongs as we journey into the world of sewing. Until next time, bye.